All right, I think we're ready to start again. Sound good? Everyone here? Yeah. So, let's write a custom ord instance that puts the activated users first. If we do this in the naive way, where we say, oh, sorry, everyone, I pushed the code that I've written up until now. So if you weren't able to follow along, then now is the time to pull, and then you're right back on track. So I'm going to write an ordering instance for user, where the activated field matters first. So the way you do that is compare u1, u2, is compare user activated u1, user activated u2. And this says if you're comparing two users, just compare their activated field. And this will fail tests. And the reason that it fails tests is because less than or equal to and greater than or equal to are expected to be anti-symmetric, which means that if something is both smaller than or equal to something else and greater than or equal to something else, then they should be equal. And this is not the case anymore, because now if two user activateds are the same, that doesn't mean that the entire user is the same anymore. Make sense? So before I go on to fix this, I'm going to give you a shorter way of writing this, which is some type level stuff to get your head around, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. So we're going to import data.ord and data.function. Function is so that I can write on. They can use the function called on, and ord so that I can use the opposite ordering in a moment.
Which function for function?
On. Because actually, if you now look at two users, username is Sid, user activated true. So if I sort this from import data.list, Sid is not a string. Can you see it now?
I see that's your cursor, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm showing. So if you have two users where one of them is activated and the other one isn't, I'll press some more enters. Now the user activated false user is first in the list. So I need to sort it in reverse. And that's what I will use data.ord for.
So when I do this, I don't understand why this fails if you do it over user activated and not over username.
Because one of the properties of an ordering function is that they're anti-symmetric, which means that if something is less than or equal to something else and also greater than or equal to something else, then they need to be equal. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So you need to compare both. But now, in order to compare something in the opposite way as what you expected, you need to use a new type wrapper, which is called down. And down just has a different ordering instance and nothing else, which means that it will sort in reverse. And now the thing I put in GHCI is indeed correct, where the user activated true comes first in the list. That makes sense? Now, in order to make this a bit more pretty, because this is quite horrifying code, especially if you're going to extend it, is we're going to use some functions. One is called on. On lets you modify a function of two arguments. So instead of what I'm writing here, I'm going to write something else. I'm going to say compare on down dot user activated. And that does the exact same thing. Okay? Now, if you don't understand it, that's fine. We can just leave it. The other thing you need to know that is that the result of compare is an ordering. And ordering has a monoid instance, or a semigroup instance rather. So that means if you have an ordering, this has a monoid instance and it's less than, equal, or greater than. If you combine a less than with something else, for example, an equal, then you get the first thing. If the first thing you put in there is equal, then you will get the second thing. So that just means compare by something first and then something else later. So what that means is you can do compare this and then combine this with compare user name. And this will, or should, form an instance that passes the tests. But not down, like so. And this should pass the tests now. And if you really want to shorten this, you can do compare on down.userActivated username. Because a function, the type of a function that returns a monoid is also a monoid, which means you can do what I just showed you here, but you don't need to. Okay, so now we have something that passes the tests with a custom ord instance. Now let's start writing some actual implementation of the little tool I described. To use the tool, we're going to run the executable with some arguments. And to do something different based on the arguments, we need to get args from system.environment. And from system.exit, I want to import die. And I'm going to show you the types of those. Get arguments is an IO of list of string, which means in an IO context, you can get a list of strings, which are your arguments. And die is a function that takes a string, which is the error message, and crashes with a nice exit code, and it also prints the error message to standard error instead of standard output. So we're going to use both of these. And I'm going to say if you get any arguments, then just crash did not understand arguments. This should still compile. But now every time we run the test suite, we don't get to see what happened if we ran this thing. So what we're going to do is say exec, which means every time something changes, first run the tests, and then exec. In this case, it will be user exe. Voila, and this does crash like you expected.
Can you paste the command in the buffer because the line is from there?
Right. And just to make sure that the newest version is always ran in this exec, you will want to do also -- copy bins. Copy -bins, yeah. So I'll add that here as well. Like so. And then you should indeed see your exit failure 1. This one here, by the way, is just the exit code. Everyone with me until here? Do you understand what's happened? Okay. So now let's build some of the infrastructure that we'll need. If we use data.async to write a small JSON file, so let's call it users file. I'm going to define which file that is. And I'm just going to say users.json. And now I want to write two functions. One is called store users, which gets a list of users and stores them. And then the second one is called load users, which gets a list of users in IO. Does it make sense, these types? We're going to use asyn to to write that. And just to make it clearer, I'm going to import ASIN as JSON, not qualified.
Can you swap the frames, put the source on the left at this point? It's getting quite large.
Yeah. I can also do this. To store the users, we're going to use encode file from data.asyn. Oops. And we're going to give the argument, which is the users file, and then a list of users, like so. And this should just compile. And because we have this argument on both sides, we can just leave that out. Make sense? Still with me now? Okay. So the next problem is, the next thing we will want to do is json.decode file strict encode, users file. And this will decode the users file from JSON to whatever type that we pull out of it. So the compiler will figure out which type it will need to compile based on the return type that you're going to use here, which is going to be list of users. But this thing returns a maybe, in a maybe this being nothing when there is an error while decoding. So in that case, what we want to do is case match on it. If it's nothing, then return the empty list. If it's just a list of users, then return the list of users. And that needs to be in a do block. Does this make sense? There is a shorter way to write this, which is to say map from maybe empty list over this thing. But that's a bit complex to explain right now, so let's not do that. Okay? Now if you run this again, everything should be okay. All right, so now the first command I want to implement is called list. So if we case match on this arguments list, then let's say list users. And list users will be an IO action that just loads the users, sort them, show them, and then put them in lines, these strings, and then output them to the command line. And sort is in data.list. And now on the left-hand side, we still get a crash because the exact thing we did needs the arguments that we want to try out. So let's say list. And now we still get a crash because this file doesn't exist. So what I want to do is, if this file exists, then use whatever's inside. If it doesn't exist, just use an empty list of users. So the way you do that is you import path IO. And path IO has a nice convenience function called forgiving absence. Forgiving absence is quite cool. Do GHCI, import path.io. Forgiving absence turns a function that, let me do type applications to make it a bit easier.
Two imports of that.
What do I, sorry? Oh, yeah. Doesn't really matter. Voila. So forgiving absence takes an IO action that could work with a file, and it turns it into an IO action that returns a maybe if the file doesn't exist. So the way you use that is you say here, forgiving absence over this IO action. And then you can, instead of getting just US, you will get just US. If you get just nothing, that means there was a file, but the decoding failed, in which case you also want an empty list. Oops. Now run the testing loop again. And now you get an empty list of users because we didn't have any. But at least we get something that passes. Does everything until now make sense?
Is there a way to unwrap that easily?
Yes. So the way you do that is from maybe empty list for giving absence dollar this thing. Oh, and you need to fmap it. You see why I didn't do that?
Yeah.
You can also use join somewhere, but that's even more complex. Okay, so the next thing I want to write is add user, which will take a string, which is a new user we want to add. The name of it, and then I want to make it deactivated by default. So let's make the load users. So load the users from the file. Oh, actually, let's do that later. First, we're going to check if this thing is valid. So you could do if n is a valid username, then add it, otherwise don't. But there is a nicer way to do that using evidence, where you do case pretty validate username n of if it is not valid, you will get a very nice error message in the left, and in that case we want to say invalid username and show the error. Otherwise we get a username in the right. If we get a username in the right, that means we can load the users and then store the users with the one that we just got at the front, and the one that we just got will be defined as username equals UN, user activated equals false. Pretty validate is in data.validity. And now username doesn't have a validity instance. That's because I need to derive it. Validity username. Yes? All right. And now we should be able to do user exe add sid. Did not understand arguments because I still need to hook that up. Voilà. And now in my users.json, I have the one new user, and if I now run the loop again with listing, then indeed you get this sorted list of users. And I'm gonna, but now there's a problem, because if we want to define that usernames don't have no white space, for example, then we need to define a validity instance that does that. And because we've derived the generators will already match the validity requirement automatically. Now, in order to define this for ourselves, I'm going to show you a little tour around this validity library. So if you go to the page on Hackage, I'll paste it in the Discord. Ta-da. And you go to data.validity. There's a bunch of documentation here, and the interesting ones for us is going to be, I want to say for each of the characters in this string, it should not be white space. So a string is a list of elements, so we're going to do something involving a list. So if I just look up list, then I find decorate list, this function. This function allows you to say, for each of the elements of this list, I'm going to supply a custom validation function, and you'll make a custom validation object out of that. Okay. So we're going to use decorate list in this validate instance. Username US. CS as in characters. And now for each character, I want to define a validation function. And the way that works is I want to declare that this thing has an invariant. And that is declare here. So declare, you describe the invariant, you make the Boolean checking function, and then it makes a validation for you. So you say declare is not white space, not char dot is white space C, and then you need to import data.char. This should work as is. Doesn't. It's just this space, not this white space. There we go. So now if I do user exe add hello world, it will tell me you're not allowed to do that. Or maybe not. Why doesn't it tell me? Oh, because I say list users instead of add users. If I try to add hello world, I get this nice little error message that says invalid username, the element at index 5 in the list, that's this one. There is a violation of an invariant that this is not white space. So you get this nice error message automatically. Now, if I had a user where let's just show you that. If I had an invalid user and I did pretty validate, let's do either id undefined pretty validate username equals username hello world, user activated equals true. If I had an invalid user because the username is invalid, I need to define validity for users as well. And because this is entirely structural, it's generated for us. Then I do need to do put string. Then I get this nicer error message that I will show you here. Then it says, there is a problem in user in the field username. The element at index 5 is not white space. So it really builds up this nice error message that shows you exactly where the problem lies. And if this was in a list, then, oops, that doesn't work like that. If this was in a list, then it will be even more descriptive, saying, in this list at the element of index 0, in the user, there is a field called username, in which the fifth element of the list is supposed to be not white space, but it is. Yes?
Can you compose validations?
Yes, with the...
As an objective?
no, as a monoid. It's a monoid.
Oh, but then you short circuit on the first fail mode, right?
No, you find all the failures. So if there are multiple reasons why something is invalid, it will say so.
Monoid is sufficient.
Yeah, look.
Okay.
So if you have two white space characters, then you will get 2 times the error message, one with index 8 and one with index 5.
That's for a single validator, but if I have 2 validators that I want to compose, this monoid is enough to get me all errors for both.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Always assume that these
No, that's
because you run all side effects and you combine them.
but there are no side effects here. So the validation does no side effects, it just returns a complex Boolean.
I mean, where the effective validation is the side effect.
No, so that's just pure, that's entirely pure. So this thing is not higher kinded at all. Validation doesn't have a type constructor. It's not a type constructor, it doesn't have an argument. If you try to write an applicative instance for this, then it will say this is not well kinded.
Yeah, I get it now.
All right, so now we have our nice error message. We can continue with the listing. And there's only one more function we need to write, which is called, let's add one more user called Nick, for example. Voila, so we have two users, they're both deactivated, and the Nick one will come first. So now if we activate Sid, we should have it on top of that list. So if we match on activate, sorry? Thank you. Add user, activate. We do the same stuff with the validation again, and then we need to find the user which we just called by name. We do that with find. So that's where you say let me show you. Import data.list, find at list. Find takes a predicate and a list, and it will get you the first element of the list that matches the predicate. Does that make sense? So now the predicate that I'm going to give is the name equals the username that I just parsed. So find with this predicate in the list of users. If you don't find anything, then we're just going to die again saying user not found. Username string. And if we have found one, then we're going to change it to say that now user activated equals true. And the new list of users, we can't just prepend this value because otherwise we'll have it twice. So what you need to do is filter out all the values that are not equal to the original user that you got out of the list, and then insert the changed user that we just made. And if we then store users US prime, this should compile. Find is in data.list. If I now do user exe activate SID, voila, now SID is on top because it's activated. Ta-da! So that's the whole tiny little project that I had in mind. I have plenty of time left, so if there are any other features that you'd like to see or any more interactions with testing that you'd like to see or experience, then let me know and maybe I can come up with something. Although,
somehow duplicate the code in add user?
Yes, that's a great question. So one of the things we often see happen twice is like do something, get the users out of somewhere, do something pure with them and then store them again. So what if I had some code which was with users, which you supply a list of users, a function that takes a list of users and produces a list of users and then does the I/O that's necessary to get the list out of the file and put them back in, right? So the way you do that is you get the users out, change the users with this function, and then store the users in the new version. Make sense? So now we can refactor a bit and we can say with users like so.
You need to get rid of the do block.
Oh, it doesn't need to. You don't need to, but you can, yes. What did I do wrong?
It's also expecting a list of users, not a supposed to be US, not pure US.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
That's going to be a lot more sensible. Otherwise, you can't die in the middle.
Okay.
All right, and so we can do the same thing here with users. So that's a bit of the abstraction away already. Now, the other piece is this nastiness where you validate the username. So what you can do is with username string to username dot IOA. So you give it a username that's a string that's supposed to be a username and a func that you run if it is a username, and then instead of that you do func US, and now you do here with username n un like so. What did I do wrong? Like so. There we go, a whole bunch of abstraction. Is that what you wanted to see?
Yeah, pretty much. So this is similar to continuation, right?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
You provide a function that's basically is called at the end of the previous function.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not full CPS, but yeah, you just change everything to continuation path. And you change some of this logic to continuation path.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the operator before error is open brackets, close brackets,
Where do you see that?
with username.
Append, open, close, angle bracket.
Oh, this one. Sorry, that's just the semi-group. But you could just as well use plus plus because we're dealing with strings anyway. I can also get rid of all the dollars if you want, but I don't think that's very useful at this point.
So it's append, right?
Yeah. Well, it has to be mappend, but it could be something else. Because in these days, there is this difference. So if you look at mappend, it's defined in monoid. If you look at this thing, it's defined in semigroup. So this mappend should disappear in future versions, and in current versions it should be equal to this thing.
Can we somehow narrow the IO type and with username? So something akin to can exit? Because we
Sure, you can do that.
all die here, right? We don't need the full power of IO.
So you could do this.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, you could do that, and I highly recommend against it. The reason is if you, this needs to be a. If you do this for every kind of effect that you could possibly have, then you'll have 200 type classes in an application. And if you want to have these composed, then you need to make the monad transformers. And for every new monad transformer class, you need a quadratic number of instances so that they can all stack on top of each other. Which means that now, instead of having 200 lines of code within I/O, you have 200 lines of code in all of these weird kind of instances, and then also 200 lines of classes with another 40,000 lines of instances, which is just bonkers, right? You better just use I/O then, but you could do this. I'm thinking instance can exit list. Can I do that? Exit. Yeah, that works. So now I can do with username hello world with a space in it, and then a UN, put it in a list, and then I get an empty list, and if it's valid, then I get a list with something in it. So yes, you could do this, but it's not necessarily useful. So especially if you want to write clear code, stick with I/O for as long as possible, and if you really need something else, then use a reader transformer on top of I/O, and if that's still not enough, you're probably designing something wrong. And I mean that, by the way. That's very important for working within teams. All right? Okay, if there are no more questions about this, I want to show you a little bit about the thing that I scrapped, so that you just have an idea, because someone came up to me and asked me about it, so I might as well just show you that. No, that's really good. So the slides you have, because they're in the repository, I'm not going to go through all of the slides. What I want to show you is that if you have this little piece of code, which has a sorting function and a function to check that something is sorted. Now, the problem here is I don't want to have to think about what I want to test. So even if you have cheap tests and free generators, I still need to figure out what it means for my code to be correct in order to start testing. And that's really annoying. So what we've made here is something where you can say, press a button, and then you get the properties of your code. So this will figure out what it means for your code to be correct without you having to think about it. And there are some surprising things here. So the obvious ones are if you sort something, then it should be sorted. But here, and this is also somewhat obvious, if you sort something twice, it's the same as sorting it once. But this one is maybe not so obvious. If you sort something, then it becomes smaller. Or if you sort something and it does become smaller, if you sort something and it becomes bigger, then it means it was already sorted. So you get these properties by pressing a button. And the idea here was to make a plugin for your IDE where while you're typing, it would just constantly go, hey, is this something you wanted to write? And then you just get the test for free by the pop-up, and you copy paste it into your test suite after checking, yeah, this is indeed what I want. And then you don't even have to think about what it means for your code to be correct anymore. So this is research. I did this 2 years ago. They've probably gone further along the research path with this by now. I didn't do it anymore, and I did it in 6 months. It was research, and that means it doesn't work in practice, but the toy example still works, so the idea exists now. If you want to work on this, or do this for your master's thesis or your PhD thesis, come talk to me, and we can definitely make that happen. I didn't get to finish it because I had to make money in order to survive, and this doesn't make me money. Because it's just research.
And there are make me some money functions.
Well, that's essentially, I'm trying to make save me some money functions, right? But that doesn't help if I'm not already making money. I actually did get investment interest for this, but the investors clearly had no idea what I was doing, so I didn't end up doing it. And they expected their money back, so. Yeah. Anyway, so this is also possible, and that's, you've seen in the last 5 hours from scratch, why testing, what is testing, how do you do it, all the way to current research, what can we do at this point, what's possible. And I had an entire talk lined up about how this works in practice. The short version is it's magic, and the long version is like 3 PhD theses and my master thesis. So if you were interested in this kind of stuff, definitely come talk to me afterwards. Otherwise, I'm still here to ask questions, but I don't have any more material, so I'm going to stop it here. If there are any more questions, now is the time to ask me. No? Okay, so then I'll stop it here. Thank you very much for coming.